Hello and welcome to the Americano Show here in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention. Today we are going to be talking not about something that's going on within the Democratic Party, but about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., because there are reports, pretty reliable seeming reports, that on Friday he will stand down as an independent candidate in the presidential election. I am joined here by Ben Domenech, who is editor-at-large of Spectator World. Ben, this is an interesting side plot to this convention because actually we needed a side plot because so far it's been quite dull.
Yes, it has been. And I have to say that Chicago as a city deserves a better class of protester than the ones that we've gotten. So much for bringing back 68. We've barely had any kind of violence or anything along those lines.
Few arrests last night.
Few arrests, yeah. But nothing close to what we were expecting as recently as a month and a half ago when Biden was still going to be the nominee. And it seems that a lot of the energy went out of their sails over that. Something similar is happening to RFK, because obviously his entire approach when it came to running as an independent candidate was dependent on the fact that we have two of the most unpopular people on the top of the ticket in Joe Biden and in Donald Trump that we have ever had in the history of politics. And it's very rare to have what you had at the beginning of this cycle, where pollsters were actively talking about the number of double haters, people who did not want to vote for either candidate, who really were open to almost anybody else. And it's why a lot of the polling data early on showed, Robert F. Kennedy achieving as much as the mid to high 20s in some polls. He was nudging up against 30% even at one point. People forget this. Now, of course, once he actually got into the independent candidacy lane, once he dropped out of the Democratic contest when it became clear that he was going to have no hope there, you go from a hypothetical to a reality, and his numbers drifted downward. But he still commands enough of a portion of voters that this could be significant. And the reason is that if you look at something like the Cook Political Reports swing state poll, which just looks at those battleground states, they found, as recently as last month, which is when they were still, polling this question, they found 46% of his supporters said that if he was not in the race, that they would vote for Donald Trump. Now, with Harris in the race, his situation changed significantly. Instead of taking pretty much equally from both Trump and Biden, perhaps a slight edge to the Biden factor. In fact, he ended up, in a situation now where instead of having the argument that he's younger, that he's healthier, that he, cares about many of the same issues that appeal to both sides in kind of a heterodox way, he no longer has that argument. And especially when it comes to Kamala Harris, her appeal among younger voters, which is still, an early question, is clearly going to be higher than what Joe Biden's was. And a huge portion of RFK's support was coming from young voters. What that's going to do to this race is, of course, something that we can't just predetermine. But if he does drop out, whether he endorses Donald Trump or not, I think that the effect will be a boost to Trump's chances in some of those key battleground states where RFK had gotten on the ballot. He had put enormous efforts into getting on the ballot in some of these big states like New York and California, but it wasn't like he was going to change the outcome there. Instead, he is, I think, going to have a major impact in a state like Michigan, where he was on the ballot, in a state like Georgia, where he was on the ballot, and he could have potentially had a margin in terms of vote that was bigger than the margin of victory for either candidate, and essentially played that spoiler role. So coming out of this convention, even if Kamala Harris gets some kind of boost, and I think it's an open question whether she does, that could really be eaten up by something as simple as a third-party candidate who is taking a chunk of votes, even 1 or 2% away from Donald Trump, getting out and clearing a path for those voters to essentially become not Harris voters.
We know in Michigan that the Israel-Gaza issue is a significant factor and a worry for the Democrats, because a lot of people who would vote Democratic might not, because they oppose the Democratic Party for supporting Israel. RFK Jr. doesn't really fit into that pattern, does he? Because he was pro-Israel, and in fact, perhaps one of the reasons why his independent candidacy couldn't take flight was because he didn't have that foreign policy win.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that was certainly part of his overall argument was his opposition to the continued funding of the war in Ukraine. And that was something that, he's been more clear about than certainly Donald Trump, who basically, when he talks about Ukraine, just says it wouldn't have happened on my watch. And of course, Joe Biden, who has a very different policy as it relates to Ukraine. The Israel issue, I think you're completely right about it. If he had gone in a different direction on that, he could have perhaps captured the energy of a lot of these populist types who are in that kind of left populist lane.
Yeah.
They've shown up over the years. I've been at every convention starting in 2000 except for Tampa, and of course in 2020 there was no conventions to speak of. And one thing that does crop up quite a bit, and really started in 2004 during the Iraq War protests, continued in 2008 in the anti-globalist protests in Minneapolis, you see the same types of people at these things with the same types of signs and the same types of, chanting and everything like that. And they really never amount to all that much. The difference now is that because of the current war, this is a live issue, and Kamala Harris is clearly very scared about it in the same way that Joe Biden's supporters were scared about it having a major impact. And it's why she's sort of playing footsie with the issue. It's why she hasn't issued any condemnations of the protesters that we've seen in the streets, or any kind of distinctive statement that would set her clearly on the same path that Biden has had, or one that is more pro-Israel. And I think that we're going to see her try to continue to play some games with that, because she needs those voters in key states like Michigan.
And also, just on RFK, it speaks to the fact that the reason independent or third-party candidates often struggle is because they often have principles.
Yes, it is
so
true.
It would have made a lot of sense to him to go against Israel.
They tend to have principles and not a lot of money. And the one time that you had a significant third-party candidacy in the modern era, obviously, was Ross Perot. And he had the money to self-fund. He made a huge impact in 1992. He definitely, if you look back at the statistics, cost George H.W. Bush that election in terms of his impact and pulling more from the Bush side than especially from people mad about his fiscal policies, than he did from Bill Clinton. But I do think that one of the things that has happened since then, obviously, is that a lot of these parties on the state level really locked down and tried to make for harder ballot access laws, many of which are essentially insurmountable without money. It's one of the reasons that RFK named Nicole Shanahan as his running mate, was because she could help fund the campaign's effort to get on the ballot. And it just takes a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of lawyers. And Democrats had been suing across the country to try to keep him off the ballot in multiple key states because they were very concerned about his effect. So I think that speaks to which side was more worried about him. That now, having changed, is something that I think is going to lead to a new dynamic in this race. And we'll see what Donald Trump does in terms of trying to appeal to those people with heterodox views on a number of areas of policy. There was some discussion that RFK had talked with Trump about perhaps taking on some role in a future administration.
They had this phone call, didn't they?
This phone call that leaked, that was put out there between the two of them, discussing this potentially. I don't know how serious that is. Obviously, when Donald Trump promises somebody something, sometimes events overtake that promise. But I do think that when it comes to RFK, you could actually see him having some kind of role. Perhaps not anything that would be Senate approved, because I doubt that they would vote for him.
You suggested on the Spectator World website that it could be an environment role.
Yes, the thing that's interesting. People mostly associate RFK with his stuff on vaccines and health-related things, and particularly, of course, his opposition to sort of COVID vaccine requirements and things of that nature. The types of mandates that he opposed that actually, a lot of libertarians and conservatives and even Democrats, some of them opposed. But the truth is that his career has mostly been focused on environmental law, and so it would almost make sense for something that Trump only cares about, sort of as a side issue, as opposed to something that's a focal point, to maybe give him something along those lines. And I've talked to a couple of people who think that would be a more natural fit than dealing with the hot button issue of putting him in some health capacity that would rile up everybody, especially even some of his fellow Republicans.
And RFK on the environment is not your kind of a climate change person in a way like a Kamala
No,
Harris might be?
he's more of a.
He's not a net zero guy.
Think about it. He's a hunter, and he has all this taxidermy. He's a falconer, all these other things. He's essentially a conservation guy, and so I think if you gave him some kind of job that would be in that space, let him go and do clean water and clean rivers, and I don't think that Republicans would really object to that.
Yeah. The upshot of this story then is that the two-party duopoly in American politics it endures, and it will always endure because there seems to be no way of breaking it.
One of the things that was so interesting about when Donald Trump decided to run was that he entered at a moment when the Republican Party had gone through essentially a significant identity crisis. They'd had the Tea Party 6 years earlier. They had had the failed Romney candidacy in 12. And then he made the decision to run within that party, understanding, I think, that the opinions of both the conservative faction and the establishment, more moderate faction, both sides were essentially out of touch with a huge swath of their own voting electorate. So instead, what does he do? He decides to run as a Republican after having bandied about the idea of running on the reform label before, after saying that he was a Democrat, earlier in his career, et cetera. He decides to run as a Republican, and he takes over this party that's going through an identity crisis and has, in very short order, redefined it according to his own priorities. You saw that, obviously, in Milwaukee, but you also see it, I think, in the fact that this is now a party that's basically negotiating with the Democrats about who's going to give a bigger child tax credit, as opposed to the kind of talk that you saw from them back in 2012 about, being, Mitt Romney's whole shtick of businessman, you didn't build that kind of thing. It's much more of a family-focused, more populist kind of natalist type movement. Part of that is what Trump brought into the party, but part of that, I think, also is the natural extension of this new coalition that has formed and the great culture war sort that has happened in the country, where you saw essentially a lot of liberal Republicans, left of center Republicans, especially on culture issues, just become Democrats. And with that, it's allowed them the space of kind of appealing to new constituencies. And it's one of the reasons why, Donald Trump has done so well in bringing more Hispanic voters into the party than, you've seen really since 2004, and having basically a new coalition that is built in the way that he wants to see it, and having enough members of Congress and other politicians across the country recognize that that's the Republican coalition now, and that's who they need to appeal to in most states.
Whereas, to contrast the Republican Party with the Democrats, they have always squashed an internal revolution.
Yes.
They did it with Bernie Sanders very effectively.
Yes.
And Bernie Sanders is now, just used as a speaker at the convention.
It's really the only time that it hasn't worked the only time that it went in a way that they did not, sort of squash a leading candidate, is the Barack Obama phenomenon. And, when it was supposed to be Hillary's turn, he came in there and accomplished something that nobody really thought he could, and he did it because of the passion and the kind of upswing. But other than that, it doesn't happen. The Democrats have a much stronger hold on and control of their own partisan base than the Republicans do. The Republican base, and this is something that, I think is fun. It's important for everyone to understand. Republicans just don't like to be told what to do.
Yeah.
Most of them don't, and because of and that extends to their politics as well. You want me to do this? You think I should vote for this person? Well, you can go to hell. Yeah. And that's the kind of thing that you're a lot more from the Republican side than you do from the Democrat side, where the mantra is more of a team dynamic, and everybody has to come on in for the big win.
And it's also almost cruel, I think, to watch at this convention the way that the speakers are all almost forcing their audience to accept something that just obviously isn't true.
So this is the dynamic that I think is so bizarre about this convention. It's almost like children of a divorce or something like that. Like, we've just gotten through a divorce. Mommy and daddy are fighting, and we've made this choice now, but Dad's still hanging around. I mean, now he's in California. But the point is that I think what you're seeing happen here is a group of younger boomer generation people who are young enough to know that they're not really cool anymore, are basically at this convention wearing Charlie XCX t-shirts and sending it to their 20-something kids with awkwardly taken selfies. And I think that that's something that is, makes for an uncomfortable dynamic, because these people signed up for this thinking that they were coming to Joe Biden's convention, and they are at Joe Biden's convention. It just, now they have somebody different laid over it. Not all of them love her. They're when it comes to spin, they're all about the joy. They're all about, the vibes. They're all about, the energy is back with us. But the truth is that if you look at the polling, everything's just gone back to the way it was 3 months ago. Before the Biden spiral that happened, in beginning in June, and you've essentially reset this to a coin flip election. She's essentially in the same position that he was before, maybe a little bit up, but only a little bit. And that, I think, speaks to the fundamentals that are underlying this, which is that as much as they can talk about energy and excitement, that's something that's true of the partisans. It's not something that's true of independent voters who still say that their biggest priorities in this election are the economy, immigration, and security, both at home and abroad. And that's something that I think is not changing between now and November. And Kamala Harris is going to have to navigate a world in which she has to defend her policies on that, also essentially defend some of Joe Biden's policies, but also perhaps lean a little bit against them in implying that she'll do something different and represent that she's a change candidate as opposed to essentially the continuation of the Biden agenda.
Because the Obamas, who both spoke, Michelle and Barack, both spoke last night, they were very much pitching it as change in sort of 2008 language.
Yes. And it was very much the 2008 language, and I think it's important for us to note this. Michelle Obama, despite her husband being twice elected president, despite being an enormously popular, one of the most popular authors in the history of the country, despite owning 3 wonderful houses, now still seems to insist that America is just as racist or perhaps more racist than it's ever been. So I just want to know how many more houses she needs to own before she'll stop saying that about this country. The other thing that I love, the line from her about, we weren't Ivy League elites, that kind of thing. Really? Where did you go to school? Can we fact check that maybe?
Yes.
But I think that one of the things that you are hearing from them, when you hear from them, you're hearing a callback to the before time that a lot of Democrats would like to go back to.
Yeah.
When they saw their movement as not just insurgent, but as the way of the future, that it was going to be something that didn't just lead to Democrat success, but that was a reordering of the American political dynamic in a way that would not be drawn back. And I think that they learned, to their shock and horror in 2016, that was simply not the case. That there were enough Americans who disagreed with that, who were not down with that agenda, and who felt in fact left behind by it, ignored under it, that they would express themselves by doing something as audacious as voting for Donald Trump. And now I think that there are a lot of Democrats, smart Democrats, who are very concerned about this election because they have nominated someone who is not truly a known quantity in terms of how she can perform over the next 75 days. Kamala entered the 2020 race with a rally that was gigantic, okay, that was impressive, with a wonderful speech, drew comparisons to Obama, immediately started with a ton of momentum. It all fell apart. And it fell apart because of staffing issues, because of internal disagreements, and because Tulsi Gabbard basically gutted her for her record on crime on stage at a debate. And she never recovered from that. She went on air on CNN, I believe, afterwards, and said, leading campaigns like mine don't have to respond to things from people who are way down at the end of the ballot, implying that because Tulsi Gabbard was polling in single digits and Kamala was at that point in double, that she didn't need to pay attention to her. Instead, that was the beginning of the end of her campaign. That's all it took, that one debate moment. And so I think what a lot of smart Democrats are concerned about is what happens if that happens again with Donald Trump.
Sorry to interrupt the show, but if you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
And the Obamas know about the staffing problems and stuff because
Yes.
they were a lot of the same staff who
Yes.
used to work for Obama, went to go work for Harris, and
Yes.
promptly quit because
Yes.
they found her impossible.
And one of the things, too, that was very true of that campaign, and I think you already see it in their performance thus far, is, and there was an entire New York Times kind of after-action autopsy done on her campaign. And the number one thing that they said about it was that the campaign was too online. It was too focused on what people were saying about her on social media and having that drive everything that they did that day versus fundamentals. And I think what we're seeing already from the Harris-Walz campaign is, well, let's talk about camo hats and let's talk about his taco hot dish recipe and that kind of thing. We need to seek the viral things, and make things about vibes. And to me, that's not the kind of campaign that appeals to people at a moment of economic concern, distress about the state of the world, and frankly, major concerns about the immigration policies that have been under her leadership.
And both Michelle and Barack said that it's going to get tough. Things are going to get bad. And what they were really saying is, you're going to think you don't like Kamala Harris and you don't want to vote for her, but you're still going to have to vote for her.
Yes, yeah. I think what they're anticipating with that is, this is rolling the dice. This hasn't happened before. And people can talk about how much of a role Barack Obama played in this whole process. I think people are correct, the reporters are correct in saying that this feels a lot more like Nancy Pelosi's doing in terms of what was engineered to get Joe Biden out of the race. But there is definitely an awareness on the Obamas' part, because they are not dumb when it comes to electoral politics. They've gone through the hardest road. He had to beat Hillary. He was down, after his first debate with Romney. He had to work hard, and it really was something that it's a mythology to say that he was just sort of it was an assumption that he would get as far as he did. He had to claw his way up there, and they know how tough politics can get, and Kamala hasn't had to face that kind of thing.
And on a bit more Obama criminology, Michelle did not mention Biden last night, which ties into this idea, widely reported but never really proven, that she has fallen out with the Bidens.
Yes.
Can you explain a bit about that?
So, it extends to a lot of different things, and I would encourage people, there's been some good reporting about this. I have not done my own reporting, but I will say that there has been a significant rift between the Bidens and the Obamas that goes back multiple years, especially because they felt, meaning the Biden team in 2016, that Joe should have been the candidate, and Barack chose essentially Hillary as the candidate instead. It was almost, it was his belief at that moment that she was the better candidate to put up, and that she would be able to win against Donald Trump and win probably pretty handily. And obviously the Bidens feel that Joe would have made a better candidate, and so do many Democrats feel that way as well, that he would not have lost in that election. And then they also felt like Joe never got the credit that he deserved for what he brought in terms of his role within the Obama administration. Personally, I think that they should not want that credit because I think that Joe did not do a very good job, but that's my own opinion. But I do think that one of the things that's going to be interesting about this party is who benefits and who doesn't from what the outcome is here. Kamala Harris is a big bet. Okay, it's the roll of the dice has never been done before. Joe was only down by, they could make the argument he was only down by single digits. He could make up the difference. All the arguments he made before he got out. If Kamala Harris loses, there's going to be so many people who say, why didn't we just stick with Joe? He was a more popular candidate. He was a known quantity. He's been in politics for 50 years. His record was something that he could defend, et cetera, et cetera. He had one bad debate night, and then you knifed him. You all knifed him all at once. But I think that there's another faction that would actually benefit from Kamala winning that we're not really paying attention to yet. And that's the progressive left. The progressive left, if Kamala wins, can conceivably claim one of the problems with Joe is that he wasn't really in step with us on all of these different issues that we care about but he really was not the best messenger on it. You know, chief among them, you can look at that debate answer, the botched debate answer that he gave about abortion policy. Democrats have made abortion policy the center of everything that they're talking about over the past 3 years, including, you know, obviously at this convention. Joe, for most of his career, was a moderate on abortion. He was pro-life at the beginning of his career, you know, as a Catholic politician. And then, like many people, he sort of moved and gravitated on that issue and changed on it over the years, as did many Democrats. But he clearly never was comfortable talking about the issue the same way that someone who's a true believer now is. And that's obviously something that Kamala does talk about and talk about quite openly. And so I think that the progressive left, people like AOC, can point to someone like Kamala Harris winning and basically say, our vision for the future of the Democratic Party is the one that won out. Joe was just a transitional figure. He's about the past. He's about, you know, a point where we were about unions that were about auto workers, and now we're about unions that are about teachers, and that's the shift that's happened.
Fascinating. Lastly, Ben, we'll talk about Tim Walz.
Yes.
He is, I think, whatever one thinks of him, the appointment so far has been a success. If you look at the polls, he's the only one of the 4 presidential or vice presidential nominees who has a positive approval rating.
Yes.
And yet we're starting to see stuff coming up about him that is not good.
The Axios headline literally this morning was Tim Walz, gaffe machine.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think indicates, this is something that happens a lot. You have popular governors who are successful in pretty monolithic states, meaning red state or blue state, you know, governors who are popular to those audiences. He's from a very blue state in Minnesota. He hasn't had to face the kind of challenges before. He hasn't been called on some of his exaggerations is a nice way to put it. I would say for some of them, they do seem to be outright lies.
Quite Biden-like exaggeration.
Yes. But without the humor of Biden's fish stories, let's say. But I think that one of the things that is a real risk with Walz is when he gets on that debate stage with J.D. Vance. I think that Walz, who in his history has repeatedly refused to debate people who were running against him, I think that there's a real risk of him losing his temper. He has a temper. Everyone kind of knows it in Minnesota. It was something that he's kind of known for. It's, you know, he just runs a little hot, let's say. Yeah. And I think you can see that in some of his reactions even early on, and in some of the ways that he's, addressed people who disagree with him. I think that the possibility of him getting into a yelling match with J.D. Vance is quite high, and especially given the fact that Vance is almost certainly going to bring up the issues related to his military service, where he exaggerated and was described repeatedly as a combat veteran and talked about carrying an M16 into war and that kind of thing, when it turns out that his positions was essentially administrative, and he obviously left the National Guard when his unit was called up to go to Iraq. And so for a Marine veteran like J.D. Vance, who did go to Iraq and did go outside of the line, to call him out on that, I just think it has the makings for a real haymaker of an evening, and I can't wait to watch it. And
the IVF story is going to be crucial, because one of the reasons I think when the Harris team were thinking about Walz, they were thinking about that debate with Vance, and they were thinking there'll be this moment where he can say, your Catholic beliefs mean that I couldn't have my family, and how dare you intrude? And now that's been completely undermined. Why? Explain for our viewers.
Well, so I mean, for people unfamiliar, the simple fact is that he hasn't just said it once. He's repeatedly claimed that I would not have a family without IVF, that he would not have his kids without IVF. IVF is obviously an expensive, intrusive, and ethically, controversial process in some portions, particularly among Catholics, and J.D. Vance is a Catholic. And that's very different than the procedure that they actually use, which is IUI, which is, frankly, is inexpensive, not invasive, and does not require anything and doesn't have any of the ethical quandary issues related to it that many people have about IVF. And it's clear that he wanted to insert himself in that conversation, that was happening around the country. And Democrats have made it a real hitting point, the idea that Republicans are opposed to IVF. What you actually see in polling data is Republicans are not opposed to legal IVF. When they implied that after the Alabama ruling that led to an IVF conflict that had to be resolved by the legislature, the Senate Republicans in particular, but congressional Republicans en masse stood up to put out their statements saying, oh, no, we're entirely in favor of keeping IVF legal. And it's something that is simply used by Democrats as a cudgel to say, to suggest that they're going to pull that back or make it illegal. The thing that I think is true about Walz is that when you look back at his exaggerations, there are a lot of them, not all of them, but there are a lot of them that seem to be intentional exaggerations designed to give him a useful political talking point. And that's, by the way, the difference with Biden. His exaggerations are often just ridiculous old man stories, and I mean, it's some of them are quite funny, I have to say, but not all of them. The point being, seem to be designed to create, something that he can then use as a political cudgel against his enemies. And I think that, as people get to know more about Tim Walz, I think that there's going to be more reporting about this. Keep in mind, it's the New York Times that is the reason that we know about this truth about the IVF story. It's not like some conservative journalist dug it up. And the truth is that having now, I've emailed the authors of many different stories now, about 8 different stories. The Star Tribune has actually, to their credit, corrected their article and their headline.
Oh, I saw you
added, and they have added it now, an editor's note after they didn't initially. To their story, which literally was, Tim Walz's IVF journey. And the thing is, he didn't have one.
And absolutely, lastly, Ben, I want a brief answer to this because I've taken up too much of your time. Is Kamalamania already cracking up?
So I don't really believe Kamalamania outside of Democrat partisans was ever real. I do think that it was more just relief that Joe Biden was not going to be their vehicle this fall. I think that it's not going to really experience a test, though, until the debates that happened and that begin at least next month. When Donald Trump gets on stage with her, it's going to be a new challenge for him, but it's going to be a new challenge for her too. And I think until we see how they perform, there's going to be a lot of nervousness on her side of the aisle about how that's going to go. They've seen her fail in debates in the past. They've already lost one candidate because of a debate, and I think that they're going to be very concerned about her performance. And I mentioned her before. Tulsi Gabbard is apparently sitting down with Donald Trump and helping him do debate prep for how to go after her.
Gosh. Right. Well, thank you very much, Ben, for coming on to Americano. It's been great talking to you.
Great to be with you.